We love audience requests here, and today we're going to cover one of those, a hotly contested issue. Sympathetic snare buzz. Okay, this is a complicated issue because what's happening is the resonance that we've gone to so much trouble to get out of our tom and out of our snare drum is now causing all sorts of noise when we hit one or the other of them. And it goes both ways. The snare drum will make the tom ring a little bit too. The short answer to this issue is there's no getting all the way rid of it. The best you can hope for is to minimize it. And this goes not only for tom to snare drum, but also between the toms and often in the studio, the kick drum causing the toms to resonate and sort of sing all the time into their mics and into the overhead mics. It's less of a live scenario issue, but it's still something to think about. Any of us that came up listening to music in the 90s came up with a really big drum sound in the grunge era, Nirvana records, stuff like that. It's a big room sound, the drums sound big all over the place. They're bleeding into everything, and it's sort of a collective sound. And at the same time, you can hear everything really clearly because they're all so close mic'd, and there's a combination of microphones creating the complete sound. That leads us into a kind of thinking about how the drums are supposed to sound, where each one is sort of separated and compartmentalized and clear. And when you're dealing with an acoustic resonant instrument, you can't really have it both ways. Either you have dead sounding drums that don't interact, or you have resonant sounding drums that do. Right now, this drum is tuned in the mid to high range, and this tom is tuned sort of in a mid range. I'm going to hit each of them with the wires off so you can kind of get an idea of the pitches that we're dealing with here. The first place that I notice people going when they're experiencing this issue is that they'll engage the wires and they'll tighten them and tighten them and tighten them, thinking more tension is going to mean less sympathetic buzz. It definitely made a difference, but it didn't make it any quieter. It just made it shorter. And now it cuts off almost like a gate, like it's there and it's gone. But what did we do to our snare sound? We choked it off completely. The drum can't resonate now, and anything low and quiet is not even engaging the snare wires. So this is not an option. The next place to go is to figure out what we can do with the tuning and the pitch of the tom to maybe make it affect the snare a little bit less. Right now, the bottom head is tuned about a minor third higher than the batter, which is sort of in the normal range of tuning for a tom to have kind of a modern sound with a little bit of pitch bend. This is also a very resonant sound, and it will project to the audience beautifully, and it'll project to your snare drum beautifully too. So the first thing that I would do to get some of the sustain out of the drum is I'd lower the resonant head of the tom. Leave the batter head alone. Just bring the reso down so they're the same, and then see what that does for us. Okay, so now I've lowered the resonant side head down to almost matched. It's a slight bit higher, like maybe a half step or something like that, but it's almost exactly the same. Let's see what that did. I've returned this to the snare tension from the beginning of the video. The tom sounds significantly lower than it did before, which involves the interaction of the two heads. I didn't change the batter head, but now we have less sustain out of this drum, and we also have less snare buzz from the snare drum as well. It's still there, but it's shorter. It's a little bit gated sounding now as well. The next step that we can do is start to manipulate single lugs on the batter side of the tom to inhibit the resonance of the batter head near the snare drum. This is a common thing when you have accidental crosstalk between the bass drum and the floor tom as well. Oftentimes a low-tuned floor tom, especially if it's a mounted tom, will sing for days when you hit the bass drum because they're kind of close in register. So by loosening the lug of the batter side of the bass drum nearest to the floor tom, or doing the same to the floor tom, or both, you can stop that conversation between those two drums, or at least minimize it to the point where it's not relevant on the track. If the floor tom sings too much as you're playing a beat, you can run into dissonance with the chords of the guitar or the piano on the track, or more importantly with the bass guitar, and then make it sound like they're playing out of tune. Let's see what happens when I hit the batter head and slowly lower the nearest tuning peg. It's almost like a knob that's shortening that crosstalk. Now that we've gone that far, the tom is starting to sound a little gross, so maybe backing it up a little bit will help. But when it comes to toms that are tuned low, being perfectly equally tuned is less of an issue than when you're dealing with snare drums. You can have a lug all the way out of the drum sometimes, and it'll still sound nice when you strike it in the middle when you're dealing with this kind of pitch range. I'm gonna raise the pitch of that lug back just maybe a quarter turn, just a tiny bit. Everything we've done so far involves no muffling or modification of the heads at all. This is just tuning. And if you want to go more extreme and try to isolate these instruments even further, you can get into using moon gels or tape or different things like that, both on the top head of the tom or on the bottom head of the tom. In this scenario, I would fuss with the tom before I would fuss with the snare drum, because I feel like the snare drum is kind of a central voice, and if you've gotten it somewhere that you're really happy with, starting to mess around with that sound is going to become frustrating because you spend most of your time on the snare drum. It can also be useful to get into your choice of snare wires and experiment a little bit with the way the different wires behave. I feel like it's sort of taken as common knowledge that narrower wires are going to generate less snare sound, and thus be better to mitigate this kind of crosstalk between the drums. And I don't necessarily find that to be true. I've had really great experiences with 42 strand snare wires actually being better for eliminating this kind of crosstalk, because in addition to giving you a broader snare wire sound, they actually have a bit of a muffling effect because there's so much metal against the snare side of the drum. And what that means is you can actually tension them up and still get a nice sound, but they'll be at a tight enough tension that they will stifle some of that resonance, and you can get away with a little more boom out of your toms without the snare going completely bananas. I've also had good luck with 16 strand wires. It really depends on the drum, but I encourage you to experiment. Cheap snare wires will still give you an idea. You know, you can get an inexpensive set of 20s and an inexpensive set of 42s and just kind of check them out and see how they behave with your particular drum. It will differ from drum to drum, especially when you're talking about different lug counts and different bearing edges. All of those things are going to give you different results. The choice of gauge of snare side head is also going to affect this. The less material you have, the easier it'll be for ambient sounds to activate it and cause it to resonate. On the flip side, a thinner snare side head will still function well at a much higher tension than a thicker snare side head. So depending on what tuning scheme you tend to use, some situations, a 2 mil will be more effective. There might be a situation where 5 mil is better for you. But don't be afraid to just try it out and see. Take a thin one and crank it up higher and see what that does for the crosstalk. I pretty much only use 3 mil for everything, and I managed to make it work. But there's a lot of options out there that, again, depending on your situation and your instrument, could be right for you. Lastly, probably the number one thing that you could learn to do in these situations when you're really experiencing a scary amount of buzz from your snare, like if the bass amp is right next to you, which is more the problem I run into, amplifiers being nearby or monitors that are turned up super loud, more so than the tom messing with me, is I turn the wires off all the time. If there's a break in the song, if there's no drums in the bridge, I turn them off. This is something that I picked up on really early because of playing in really small clubs when you're starting out and you're mashed together on the stage and the bass amp might be right here. And it makes a lot of racket when the bass amp is hitting your drum, and no amount of fussing with the drum, no matter what you do, is going to make it not do that, because it's a huge wave coming out of that amp directly into your snare drum. And later on, playing larger stages and clubs and stuff, you've got wedge monitors on the floor, and they're like, do you want it on the left side or the right? Doesn't matter. It's going directly into your snare drum. So just knowing your band's music and knowing when you're not going to need those wires to be on, turn them off on intros, turn them off on the bridge if you're not playing in the bridge, and pay attention to that. Make it part of your performance. It will really change the way you relate to your snare drum, because it is two instruments. It's a tom and it's also a snare drum. And beyond using that sound, you can also just get into making sure that you are not getting anything out of the drum that you don't want. It's really the best way around this problem. I do tune the toms and the bass drum in live and studio situations to minimize this, but I also don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, because I don't think I've ever actually had anybody else complain about the snare buzzing. In the studio, I will have people say the toms are ringing from the bass drum almost every session, because you don't really hear it in front of you and they hear it in the control room. And then you fuss with these kind of tricks like loosening a lug or something like that, or changing the pitch relationships to make them not sympathetic with each other. The snare buzz thing is mostly frustrating to the player sitting in front of the drum. So try tuning schemes. Try adjusting your resonant side heads. Don't sweat the batter too much on the toms. Try loosening a lug near the drum. And above all else, practice learning when you don't need them turned on, and practice remembering to turn them back on if you did turn them off.